Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: Canada and the European Union retaliate against President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, targeting tens of billions of dollars worth of U.S. goods. A look at which industries are affected. The Chinese Communist Party is losing a voice on Capitol Hill. One of its mouthpieces, newspaper China Daily, will no longer be distributed there after lawmakers raised concerns. A House hearing zeroing in on China's dominance in the shipbuilding industry. What does it mean for the U.S.?
The CCP's economic warfare isn't just about trade, it's about power. And it's about coercion.
And Greenland, an Arctic island home to just over 50,000 people, just got a new leader. Why is the news making headlines? Plus details on why three major powers, the U.S., China, and Russia, are closely watching. Canada and the European Union hitting back at President Trump's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. Canada just announced 25% tariffs on over $20 billion worth of U.S. goods, while the EU is targeting about $28 billion of American exports. On the list of targets, American beef, motorcycles, and whiskey. China also signals that its response is underway.
Donald Trump's tariffs on imports of metals took effect Wednesday. They imposed 25% duties on shipments of steel and aluminum, with no countries excepted. The tariffs also hit hundreds of products made from the metals, from nuts and bolts to bulldozer blades and soda cans. Within hours, the EU fired back with $28 billion in reciprocal duties. Those tariffs will kick in from the start of next month. Speaking Tuesday in Houston, Texas, Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson said Canada could limit sales of oil to the U.S.
But when we're talking about sort of non-tariff retaliation, it could be about restricting supply. It could be putting our own export duties on products. It could be energy and minerals. It could be broader than that.
Canada is the largest supplier of imported oil to the U.S., shipping some 4 million barrels per day. Wilkinson says a levy on US ethanol is another option being considered. In Australia, the government was disappointed not to win an exemption from the new tariffs, something Trump said last month he would seriously consider. However, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said it would be counterproductive for Australia to respond with tariffs of its own.
Tariffs and escalating trade tensions are a form of economic self-harm and a recipe for slower growth and higher inflation. They are paid by the consumers. This is why Australia will not be imposing reciprocal tariffs on the United States.
Other countries facing a significant hit from the Trump tariffs include Brazil, Mexico, and South Korea. However, the new charges have been welcomed by a US Steel Industry Association, which said the measures would supercharge domestic production. Investors are less sure, with US stocks shedding more than $4 trillion in value over recent weeks amid concerns about the trade war.
China is the only country whose aluminum and steel will be tariffed at rates higher than 25%. That's because a 20% across-the-board tariff on all Chinese imports was already in effect prior to Wednesday. The 25% steel and aluminum tariffs come on top of that, bringing the total tariff rate to 45% on steel and aluminum from China. America imports very little steel directly from China, which is by far the world's largest producer of the metal. Yet Chinese steel does make its way into the United States secondhand. Some is purchased by foreign countries and reshipped to the U.S., and other amounts of it are mislabeled and resold through various channels. A source of Chinese Communist Party propaganda on Capitol Hill is losing its grip. The communist-controlled newspaper China Daily will no longer be distributed on Capitol Hill after lawmakers raised concerns. China Daily is one of several major state mouthpieces controlled by the CCP's propaganda department. The paper says its English edition, quote, actively publicizes Xi Jinping thought on socialism. In other words, the direct ideology of the Chinese regime's leader. The newspaper also says it strives to influence public opinion in other countries in favor of communist China. For years, China Daily has been delivered to all congressional offices along with other major publications. Since 2020, some lawmakers have pushed to end China Daily's distribution in congressional offices. That's after the paper had paid major U.S. newspapers millions to run inserts that paint the Chinese regime in a positive light and downplay its human rights violations. Other Chinese state-backed media outlets are still actively generating content for the U.S. audience. That includes Xinhua News Agency and CGTN, the overseas arm of Beijing's state-controlled broadcaster. China's efforts to dominate maritime strength and shipbuilding taking front and center at a House hearing Tuesday. Members of the House Armed Services Committee vow to, quote, continue to produce the highest quality, safest, and most advanced warships on the planet. That effort to counter China's dominance in the sector.
The Chinese Communist Party is trying to dominate trade logistics on the world's oceans, including shipbuilding sectors and shipping services. The U.S. argues its acts to do so are undercutting business opportunities and restricting competition and choice. The Democrat and Republican leaders of the House's Select Committee on the CCP are at the hearing, united in their calls to hold the CCP accountable for its disregard of U.S. trade law. Here's the Democrat ranking member on the committee speaking about the issue just days ago.
The CCP's economic warfare isn't just about trade, it's about power. And it's about coercion, right? Because once they're able to knock their competition out, they're able to basically monopolize the market, then they can use coercion. And guess what they use the coercion for? It's not just economic issues. It's all kinds of other issues.
Now the U.S. is taking action to try to reverse the impacts. The Trump administration is taking steps to promote the U.S. shipbuilding and maritime industry.
We used to make so many ships. We don't make them anymore very much, but we're going to make them very fast, very soon. It will have a huge impact to further enhance our national security.
Trump will create a new office of shipbuilding within the White House, provide tax incentives to encourage shipbuilding in America, and he's considering an executive order to enforce tonnage-based fees on Chinese-built and Chinese-flagged ships that enter U.S. territory. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
An election on Tuesday on an Arctic island, home to just over 50,000 people, has garnered global attention. That's because the island has found itself in the middle of a rivalry between three major powers, the U.S., China, and Russia. That island is Greenland. Greenland's center-right party just won a parliamentary election. What's the party's stance toward U.S. President Donald Trump, who pledged to take control of the island? And how does Greenland's relationship with China measure up to its U.S. ties? Let's dive in.
Greenland's pro-business opposition party won Tuesday's closely watched parliamentary election. Democratic beat out the incumbent left-wing coalition in a vote overshadowed by U.S. President Donald Trump's pledge to take control of the island, a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark. Democratic finished just over 5 points ahead of the opposition Nalarak party, with nearly 30% of the vote. The former favors a slow approach to independence from Denmark, while the latter has pushed for a rapid break. Democratic's leader Jens Frederik Nielsen told reporters that, quote, "We don't want independence tomorrow. We want a good foundation." Now the party will try to form a governing coalition, says Democratic lawmaker Anna Wangenheim.
I'm overwhelmed and I'm very happy. Very happy. Our main focus will be the politics we've been elected for. Then we will have to talk to the other parties where they stand.
Greenland's population of just 57,000 has been caught up in a geopolitical race for dominance in the Arctic. Melting ice caps are making Arctic resources more accessible and opening new shipping routes. Both Russia and China have intensified military activity in the region. Since taking office in January, Trump has vowed to make the vast mineral-rich island part of the United States, saying it is vital to U.S. security interests.
One way or the other, we're going to get it.
Many Greenlanders were alarmed when Trump initially declined to rule out military force to take control of the territory, although he later softened his stance, saying he would respect the will of the local people and was ready to invest billions of dollars if they joined the U.S. That idea has been rejected by most Greenlanders. And on Monday, in the final debate before the election, leaders of the 5 parties currently in parliament unanimously said they did not trust the U.S. president. Meanwhile, Denmark's prime minister has said Greenland is not for sale, but made it clear that it is up to the local people to decide their future.
Greenland's export industry is more than 10 times as dependent on China as it is on the U.S. In 2023, Greenland exported $380 million worth of goods to China, compared to about $28 million to the U.S. But on the other hand, the United States is the biggest provider of foreign direct investment to Greenland. The U.S. also maintains a military presence there, a U.S. Space Force and Air Base. Turning our attention now to Hollywood, critics have been suggesting for decades that Tinseltown has been appeasing Communist China to stay afloat. NTD's Sam Wong was out on the National Mall in D.C. to hear what the people have to say.
There are allegations suggesting that Hollywood is engaging in self-censorship, and part of that is because they're seeking Marxist assets in China, and then they're intentionally cutting out contents that involve China's human rights violations and other things. So I guess the question would be, are you concerned that China has some level of influence in Hollywood?
I would say if you have investment in Hollywood, then you have control in Hollywood or some propagandized influence.
I like a comedy movie, so I'm looking for a good laugh. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to that.
The world is ran by money, and I think they want money, and China's going to pay them.
I mean, I just saw Gladiator and Moana recently, so
Was it good?
it was good, but there's no China in it.
If certain companies do portray that, then China might ban them because they're showing these things, and then they'll lose money, so they don't do that as much.
Well, they definitely should portray that more. In films and movies. They're just not going to be shown in China, obviously. That's a shame that happens to happen. You can't just say what you want to say. But that's the freedom we have here, and they don't have it there.
Coming up, China has officially labeled bird flu an emerging risk targeting humans, and local eyewitness accounts say isolating facilities are being built across the country. Beijing confirming talks with Russia and Iran on the Iranian nuclear issue. This as President Trump ups pressure on Tehran to agree to a new deal. The Dalai Lama rejecting comments from Beijing, saying it would choose the spiritual leader's successor. More on how China's remarks differ from what the Dalai Lama has said, and more after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Chinese authorities are stepping up its measures to tackle avian influenza in humans. The country's top health body issued a notice recently urging all levels of disease control agencies nationwide to monitor the multiple viruses that are spreading in the country. Viruses listed out in the notice include influenza, COVID-19, dengue fever, norovirus, monkeypox, bird flu, and other emerging infectious diseases. The notice also ordered local CDCs to closely monitor the transmission of these viruses from animals to humans. Earlier this month, a southern city in China launched their first round of bird flu testing on humans following the notice. Its local CDC collected samples from professionals who are exposed to bird and poultry farms. NTD has previously reported on bird flu human infections in China based on eyewitnesses' reports and whistleblowers from the medical supply industry. Recently, more reports have been coming out via China's short video platform Douyin, the Chinese version of TikTok. One of them came from someone on the platform who claims to be a CDC employee in the southern city of Shenzhen. He says more and more human cases of bird flu are appearing in his area. Shenzhen is a metropolitan city that sits next to Hong Kong. The person also said he's seen bird flu patients being sent to isolation facilities. Other eyewitness reports echo that statement. One Chinese internet user said many cities have built isolation facilities next to highways, which are typically far away from residential compounds. And in China, authorities have reported what they described as sporadic cases of bird flu in humans. But whistleblowers from the regime's disease prevention and control sector said the CCP is covering up the outbreak. NTD's Melina Weisskopf discussed with Megan David, associate professor at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Megan. So the Chinese regime has confirmed sporadic cases of bird flu or H5N1 in humans in China after previously staying silent about outbreaks. How concerning is this, Megan, and should U.S. officials be paying closer attention?
We should be concerned about avian influenza globally. And the reason is that this is carried by migratory birds that cross boundaries of countries and can cross water bodies and infect, including not just humans, but other mammals. We've been struggling with not just outbreaks within our poultry industry in the United States, but also our dairy industry.
Now, 2 workers in China's disease prevention sector told the Epoch Times that the regime is covering up the severity of respiratory outbreaks and that human-to-human transmission of bird flu has occurred. What do we know about the virus's ability to spread between humans and its severity in those who are infected?
Highly pathogenic avian influenzas have a tendency to spread very easily among birds and sometimes spread among mammals. We don't often see a lot of human-to-human transmission. In the United States with H5N1, we have not yet documented human-to-human transmission. Globally, there are challenges with avian influenza mutation because what happens is when you have a mutation that allows for either greater severity or more easy spread, whether that's from a mammal to a mammal or from a human to a human, that can be a real concern because it could take off very quickly and then infect people who are not part of our current surveillance programs, where we are looking at, for example, workers who work with infected poultry or infected dairy cows. The biggest issue is that the more people and animals that are infected, the more opportunities we have for these small changes in the genetics. So a tiny mutation, if it is favorable for the virus to then continue and to carry forward, especially if it does set up a transmission chain.
A Chinese disease prevention executive told the Epoch Times that isolation areas are being expanded nationwide in China and that the regime is preparing for potential mass fatalities. Should we be concerned about the early signs of another pandemic? What action should the U.S. and Americans take at this point?
The most important thing is actually global coordination of information and response. I mean, regardless of country, making sure that we are working together to understand where the virus is, who's being infected, and whether there are confirmations in terms of human-to-human spread, and sharing of the genetic sequences so that we can identify and understand if there are any shifts or drifts in the genome, or worse, what would be a reassortment event, where you might have whole pieces of one genotype kind of swapping out with pieces of another that could allow for much more rapid changes.
What are scientists looking at with regards to tracking this virus, considering the fact that China doesn't share all of its data with the world?
Yeah, when we are looking in the absence of data, it can make it very difficult, but there are things that individual countries can do and certainly what our public health authorities can do in order to identify things. And these really include 2 different kinds of outlooks. One is on the animal health side. We recognize that the disease is very severe, often fatal in poultry, kind of difficult to miss when you're having a problem. It's a little bit trickier on the dairy cow side, and I think that better global surveillance in dairy cows is really warranted, given that what we've seen in the United States, now that we're doing more active surveillance of milk, is that there are multiple genotypes that are able to infect dairy cows, suggesting that the birds may be carrying it and spreading it in ways that are outside of the control efforts that we might have. The other important area to really hone in terms of surveillance is on people. And that is when you have infected people, to make sure that we're doing the genotyping needed to understand the transmission dynamics and the other potential ways in which it might be spreading, and to do the case tracing efforts. And so globally, this is something that each country is empowered to do and is able to at least monitor what's occurring within their own borders.
Megan Davis, thank you so much for that explanation and your time joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
The meeting has been confirmed. China says it would hold a meeting with Russia and Iran this Friday on the Iranian nuclear issue. That's as the U.S. ramps up pressure on Iran to reach a deal that would block Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Iran and Russia would send their deputy foreign ministers to the meeting.
President Trump said he has sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader calling for a direct negotiation on the nuclear deal. Ties between Iran and Russia have deepened following Russia's war on Ukraine. Both countries signed a strategic cooperation treaty and both have good relations with China. Iran has long denied wanting to develop a nuclear weapon. However, the UN atomic watchdog has warned it is dramatically accelerating enrichment of uranium up to 60% purity, close to the weapons grade level of roughly 90%.
A debate between the Dalai Lama and Beijing over where the spiritual leader's successor will be born. Tibetan culture believes that when the Dalai Lama dies, his soul will reincarnate, and followers would find the child believed to be his reincarnation and name him the successor. But the Chinese Communist Party has been insisting it will choose the next Dalai Lama. The Tibetan government in exile rejected that statement Tuesday. This comes after the Dalai Lama said his successor will be born in, quote, the free world, described as outside China. The CCP said yesterday the current Dalai Lama was approved by the central government and that any reincarnation of living Buddhas must comply with Chinese laws and regulations. But the 89-year-old Dalai Lama says in his new book, any successor that China names would not be respected. He has lived in exile in India since 1959. Luxury car maker Porsche is battling high costs and weak demand in China. The German brand saw its earnings per share slash by almost a third in 2024. Here's a closer look.
Porsche warned there could be a bumpy ride ahead this year. Investors were spooked and shares dropped 4% after the luxury car maker said Wednesday a lot of factors could hit earnings. It cited its large-scale restructure, trade tensions and growing competition in China. And that's even before the possibility of higher US tariffs on EU imports. Sales dropped 3% last year and it expects even lower numbers this year. Low sales in China haven't helped, with a drop of 28% last year, and it's also seen tepid electric vehicle demand.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.